Inflation in Turkey jumped to a 24-year high 1 week after the central bank cut interest rates again. Inflation now stands at 83% according to the State Statistics Agency. However, an independent inflation research group claims that the actual rate stands at a whopping 186%.
We start today's program in Turkey, where a lot of people are currently facing a difficult time. Because of surging prices, the new year begins with long queues for bread, which is at least still affordable. Fruit, meat and fish have become luxury goods for many Turks. Vendors are stuck with their perishable products. Their customers are forced to budget their liras tightly. The currency is rapidly losing its value. It's a cause of anger for many in Turkey.
Prices are high. We're really struggling. We have 2 children who go to school. We are only earning minimum wage, and it's hard to make a living.
I'm 19 years old, and I'm not hopeful. I don't think the situation here in Turkey will improve. I don't see a future here. I actually want to go abroad. This is true for most of us.
I don't think inflation is around 80%. It's much higher. I don't know whether the official figures are true or not, but the inflation I feel is much more. That's why it's getting harder and harder to live.
Hiç ben bu kadarına rezalet bir hayat görmedim. Akşam yatıyorum, sabah kalkıyorum zam.
Turkey's economy is in tatters. Runaway inflation and a collapsing lira have pushed millions of Turks to the brink of financial ruin and slammed factories, farmers and retailers across the country. More than 2/3 of people in Turkey are struggling to pay for food and cover their rent, fueling a surge in mental illness and debt. But it wasn't always this way. The Turkish economy has come on leaps and bounds over the last 2 decades, averaging 5.8% yearly GDP growth between 2002 and 2021. So, what went wrong? Annual inflation is around its highest level in decades, devaluing salaries and devouring savings, less than a year before President Recep Tayyip Erdogan runs for re-election.
Heard all kinds of strategies, how people are trying to get by, especially those who have to survive on a minimum wage or a pension. They buy less, consume less, obsessively compare prices. They are working a second or third job. They don't travel. They don't go to restaurants anymore. Many people tell me they are making debts. And many young people tell me their only plan is to somehow leave Turkey and try to live abroad. So this crisis has really hit the Turkish middle class and the poor, of course, and that's devastating.
In surveys, more than half of the population say they can barely afford their daily groceries. Almost 3/4 of Turks are in debt. And almost everyone complains about a drop in income. These figures show how desperate the situation is.
Of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who has insisted on lowering interest rates in defiance of we have entered a downward trend in inflation, leaving the peak behind, unless there is an unexpected global development, Turkey's finance minister, Nurettin Nebati, wrote on Twitter. The blow of rising prices has fallen particularly hard on the poor and the middle class. More than half of working Turks earn around the minimum wage, which is worth less than $300 a month because of the Turkish lira's vast devaluation against the dollar. As the lira has sunk, people have watched their salaries lose purchasing power and the value of their savings evaporate.
Much is what's going on with imports and exports in Turkey, ultimately down to President Erdogan's unconventional approach to monetary policy?
Well, it's, I think, important to mention again that to a certain extent we observe, of course, globally rising import volumes due to increasing oil and gas prices. That is out of control, of course, of any government. But on the other hand, it is the monetary, but also the whole economic policy of the Turkish government that is also responsible for the widening of the trade deficit. So over the last 2 years, we have observed this wrong policy that made the Turkish lira the weakest currency in the world. And normally, under such conditions, we would observe that imports are dropping and exports become competitive and should rise. But that doesn't happen in Turkey because of this wrong, unpredictable and uncertain economic policy. It is prohibiting investors to enter the country, and as a result, Turkey is not able to capitalize this weak lira and to increase exports.
Turkey's crisis has been years in the making, as political turmoil and what critics call Mr. Erdogan's slide toward authoritarianism have made the country less attractive for many investors. Turkey has a substantial trade deficit and significant foreign debt, and the government has tapped its foreign currency reserves to try to slow the collapse of the currency. The coronavirus pandemic cut deeply into tourism income, and upheaval in global markets exacerbated by Russia's war in Ukraine made inflation a threat to economies around the globe. But while other countries raised interest rates to keep prices in check, Mr. Erdogan has repeatedly cut them. Last month, the International Monetary Fund recommended that Turkey raise the interest rate to counter inflation and grant more independence to its central bank, which is widely seen as doing Mr. Erdogan's bidding. But in late November, the central bank lowered rates yet again to 9%, the most recent of a series of cuts that have brought the rate down from 14% in August. In speeches and interviews, Mr. Erdogan has described low interest rates as part of a plan to foster economic growth by stimulating manufacturing and making Turkish products more attractive for export. He has blamed the country's economic woes on unspecified foreign forces, while suggesting that Turkish families are in fact better off than people in wealthier countries. Mr. Erdogan has tried to play down inflation, saying it is not a crippling economic threat and vowing that the government would take action against exorbitant price increases. But in the US, inflation has fallen to under 8% annually after interest rate increases, while yearly inflation in Turkey is more than 10 times that rate. To soften the blow, Mr. Erdogan's government has increased the minimum wage twice since January, funded accounts to protect savings in local currency from devaluation, launched a multi-billion-dollar housing subsidy program, and backed other projects to help the poor. The economy has continued to grow, expanding by 11% in 2021, suggesting a recovery from the pandemic. Economists expect more modest growth of around 5% this year.
Well, this number, Stephen, comes from Turkey's state statistics agency, as you mentioned, and it's already an eye-popping figure. But what's striking is many Turks no longer believe the official data. They think inflation is much higher, so do opposition politicians and economists who have started to openly question the reliability of the government's figures on inflation. Today, a well-known independent research group announced that Turkey's annual inflation, in fact, rose to more than 175%.
And most of that anger is directed at him, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Many blame him for the drastic plunge of the lira.
We have problems paying our rents, our bills, and accessing healthy quality food. We're going through a huge economic crisis that shakes all of us. I have 2 children. The cheese I used to put between their school sandwiches was 20 liras last year. Now it's 84 liras. And I've had to start buying cheaper brands. But even those are getting more expensive. How can people who earn minimum wage still manage to pay their rents and make a living? They can't. The situation has become so painful for many of us. People are at their limits.
Erdogan is running for re-election, but his popularity ratings have suffered greatly because of this economic crisis. So this might be an attempt to calm people down, but many people also tell me they no longer believe that President Erdogan is the man who can solve this crisis.
But the spiraling prices for many Turkish families threaten to tarnish the legacy of Mr. Erdogan, who was lauded during much of his 2 decades in power for overseeing vast economic growth that moved millions of Turks from poverty toward more comfortable, middle-class lifestyles. Many of those people now see those gains slipping away, which has damaged Mr. Erdogan's political standing to such an extent that a number of polls now suggest that he could lose next year's election. A new coalition of opposition parties challenging Mr. Erdogan has yet to choose a candidate and could struggle to remain unified. Mr. Erdogan has a long history as a deft political survivor and now sits at the top of a system that gives him tremendous power to make moves that could help him win votes. He can also count on a vast party infrastructure and a core base of loyal voters who will stick by him regardless of the economy.